And this morning, we're going to start right off with our quote herbicide boot camp. So last week we had Jesse Wheeler with us from the Acadia National Park Vegetation Management Program. And Jesse went over sort of an overview of various control methods. But today we wanted to take a deeper dive into the use of herbicides to control invasive plants. We recognize that some of you are licensed herbicide applicators and have plenty of experience with this, but other folks are not and may not become licensed applicators, might just be writing plans. And so we want folks to have sort of a common denominator of understanding about how herbicides work, because if you're going to be recommending their use, there's just certain things that make sense to learn. So we're very grateful to have with us today Ron Lamine. Ron is a veteran invasive plant controller with many, many years of herbicide experience with forestry management as well as with invasive plant management. We're very lucky to have Ron as a resource here in the state of Maine. And we also have with us this morning Amanda Devine, who's the regional steward for Maine Coast Heritage Trust and who's been a leader on invasive plant control work in the land trust community. Also a master applicator with years of invasive plant experience. So thank you so much, Ron and Amanda. And Ron and Amanda, if one of you wants to go ahead and share your screen, and if the two of you would introduce yourself briefly before you get started, that would be terrific. We're seeing the screen. It's not in presenter mode yet, but you're headed that way. So it looks like you're about to be all set. Great. Go ahead. Ron, you're muted. I don't know if you're speaking.
I am now. I forgot to unmute myself before I put the screen up. Sorry.
No
Technology
worries.
challenge. So.
Yes, no worries.
So thanks to Jesse for opening it up and talking a lot about the application methods. Like I told Nancy, she asked me, Amanda and I, to put a presentation together to you today, mostly on herbicides, mode of action, some permitting and weather. And I told Nancy, well, that's three-hour presentations. So we're going to try and summarize everything briefly. Amanda and I will, and hopefully open it up for questions, because working in the last 25 years with Nutrien, I know I've worked with a lot of you that are on this call right now, and helping you with invasives over the last 25 years. But invasives are each case is significantly different, and I learn a lot just by talking to you and working with your problems. So, like I said, I have two forestry backgrounds. I came to Maine in '82 in the budworm, and now we're starting the budworm again. So I may be retiring in the spruce budworm. But invasive is a big part of my work, and working with you as individuals, a lot of people on this call, is what I enjoy doing. So I'll let Amanda introduce herself.
Thanks, Ron. And I want to give Ron credit for doing the lion's share of putting this presentation together. I've been a little bit of a headless chicken. It's my field season right now, like so many of you. So I have, this is one of the first times that I've sat down in front of a computer in many days in a row now. So thanks, Ron, for pulling this together. So that you hear different voices and don't drift off to sleep. We're going to tag team this presentation and go back and forth. If Ron is a veteran in this world, I'm not a rookie, but I'm also not a veteran. I've been doing invasive plant work for Maine Coast Heritage Trust for 11 years now, and did some for a local land trust before that. My background is in plant ecology, so I don't come to this from the forestry world, but from the plant world. Which has, it's funny, you get into this work because you love plants and then you use your powers to kill them. So I have become good at killing plants, and perversely enough. But I have a relatively small bag of tricks that I go to in terms of chemical control when I work on Maine Coast Heritage Trust land. So my range of experience isn't quite as broad as Ron, since I haven't worked in the forestry world. So I may lean on him a little bit here to fill in some knowledge gaps that I have, but I have been doing this for quite a while, and feel within my small bag of tricks, I feel very comfortable and confident using those methods. So I'll cover those aspects of the presentation here. So Ron, I guess I'll kick it back over to you to get us started here.
Okay, so today we're going to try and talk about different herbicides, their mode of action, how they work in the plant. We'll talk about selectivity, how they work on different types of plants, whether they're residual or non-residual, what's pre-emergent and post-emergent with herbicides, before the plant emerges or after the plant emerges. And then we'll go into some of the most common herbicides choices for invasive plant control. We'll just touch on application techniques just a little, just add a few things to what Jesse spoke about last week. And then we'll go into licensing, working around wetlands, permitting, variances that you may need or may suggest that may be needed for your plan. And then I'll talk a little bit about weather impacts on herbicide selection at the end. So just summarizing, I know Jesse spoke about IPM, but when I think about herbicide applications, I think of it as one of the tools in IPM, and I like to combine at least 3 of them when I'm doing vegetation management scenario for invasives. I like to use cultural, manual or mechanical and chemical together, and combining the 3 different strategies. Cultural meaning trying to leave as many native plants as you can on site while still doing a chemical application that helps control the site and prevent invasives from reestablishing if you can. So that's the cultural side of it. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in the talk. Now I'll turn it over to Amanda, and she'll talk a little bit about herbicides and mode of action.
Thanks, Ron. So, I come from the land trust world, and because of that, I've had to be very careful about how I communicate with preserve neighbors and easement landowners about herbicides. For good reason, there tends to be a knee-jerk reaction against chemical control, which some of you maybe have encountered, or maybe you will encounter in preparing invasive plant control practice plans. But I think it's really important to talk about how these products work and what specifically they do, because I know I've found that very often, and this actually just happened to me on a property that I manage, where somebody Googles Roundup and then the conversation is just over based on what they find online. So I think starting from a place of how do these products actually do what they do is really effective, because they, on the whole, they operate on biological systems that just aren't present in people and in many other wildlife species. So if an herbicide is going to work, you actually have to put it in contact with the plant, and different herbicides contact different parts of the plant, and we'll get into that. It needs to stay on the surface of the plant, so it's not a good idea to go out and do a foliar herbicide treatment right before a big rainstorm. A lot of this is really no-brainer stuff. It needs to operate on basically part of the plant that causes it to grow and disrupt that. And different herbicides, different active ingredients that we're going to talk about do that in different ways. And then it needs to biodegrade basically into something that's not going to have long-term residual effects. Herbicides work in different ways. There's selective and non-selective herbicides. So what that basically means, and for those of you who were at my field site, we talked a little bit about this. A non-selective herbicide is going to kill pretty much all plant matter that it comes into contact with, and glyphosate is a classic non-selective herbicide. Even though there are some species that have some resistance to it, it doesn't distinguish between different types of plants. A selective herbicide typically will harm one class of plants, and usually the distinction is between dicots and monocots. So what that means for those of you who don't know that term, and I'm sure many of you do, sedges, grasses, rushes, orchids, grass-like plants basically are monocots. They have different growth pathways, and so there are herbicides that will harm broad-leafed plants, so dicots. That's pretty much all of your woody material, garlic, mustard, a lot of our invasives. with the exception of Phragmites and reed canary grass are dicots. And so triclopyr, 2,4-D, there are herbicides that won't harm monocots, that won't harm grasses and sedges. We were looking at a great example of a place where I used triclopyr-based herbicide on bittersweet growing in a field, and the bittersweet was dead and the grass all around it was still alive. So different herbicides will harm different plants. Different herbicides may continue to have some activity after they are applied. Some of them biodegrade fairly rapidly, and others will stick around and have some long-term impact. Herbicides can be applied through or absorbed through foliage. They can be absorbed through roots or both. And then they can be contact or systemic. And so a contact herbicide is just going to harm the parts of the plant that it physically touches, that it comes into contact with. People, when I start talking about using chemical control, what a lot of people say back to me is, oh, can't you use vinegar? And I don't know if we're going to have time to get into the whole notion of quote unquote vinegar. And what they mean by that is acetic acid. But there are products out there that are called, burnout type products. And acetic acid is one of those. It'll kill what's above ground. But as long as that plant has, below ground biomass, it's going to sprout back up. A systemic herbicide will come into contact with part of the plant. It will travel through that plant and it will kill the whole thing. So that's a main difference. For most of the work that I do, I am operating with my biggest arsenal is a 4.5 gallon backpack sprayer. And then on down in size. But you certainly do see work that takes place in a forestry setting. It's probably more appropriate to see a bigger tank on the back of an ATV or a tractor. So there you can go from a 100-gallon tank with hundreds of feet of hose right down to the equivalent of a Windex bottle, a 32-ounce hand sprayer. There are lots of different ways to put herbicide in contact with plants. And it really depends on your site, on your level of infestation, on what your control goals are as to what type of application you choose. There's also, there's a saying about with fruit tree pruning, the best time to prune is when the shears are in your hand. And I have found that to be true with invasive plant control. There's almost always a methodology that you can pick that's appropriate based on time of year, when you're actually out there. And speaking as a land manager, as opposed to somebody who's preparing plans for others, if I have a window in October, I can get out to this property. Well, I'm going to choose a different application method than if I'm going to be out doing the work in, say, late August. Foliar application, obviously you need to have leaves. And one thing I want to mention, and forgive me if this has already been covered, but a lot of the invasive plants that we deal with, particularly the really nasty woody invasives like honeysuckle and buckthorn and barberry all come to mind. They leaf out earlier in the spring and they retain their leaves later in the fall than a lot of our native species. So when you're thinking about how we do these methods, using a foliar application in the shoulder seasons sometimes leads to less non-target plant damage, collateral damage, if you will, than if you're doing it at the height of the growing season when everything is green. Because if you're using foliar application and it's a non-selective systemic herbicide, anything you spray is probably going to succumb. Cut stem application is a method that I like using. It's effective basically any time when your herbicide isn't going to freeze and when you don't have spring sap flowing up. So if you think about how a plant operates when that stored carbohydrate below ground starts moving up to leaf a plant out, you're not going to have any efficacy with a cut stem application that time of year, because it's just mechanically the herbicide is going to be kind of it's not going to be going down into the roots where you want to get killed. So I like to do cut stem applications. My favorite time to do that is really towards the end of the growing season when photosynthesizing plants are translocating what the leaves are producing down into the roots. Then you tend to get very good uptake. So if you're going to do a cut stem application on something like big climbing bittersweet vines, August, September, maybe into early October with some of these species that have their leaves out longer, like buckthorn. That's a particularly good time to do it. I haven't done a lot of basal bark treatment. I've done a little bit. I found some species to be more receptive than others. Autumn olive is one, young, small Norway maple is one. Why low volume basal bark treatments make a lot of sense in those situations where you have susceptible species is because you don't have, you can do them when there aren't leaves out on other plants. So it's possible to be very, very selective in the plants that you treat. It's a stickier, kind of heavier substance. I have a little 1.5 gallon hand sprayer, and you can get very targeted in your application. I haven't done, and Ron, I don't know if you want to speak to this. I haven't done any basal bark applications on a big scale. I've done, individual, a couple of small trees here and there. But as long as the stems are dry, you can do that year round. So if you have the ability to get out in January and do this work, that would be a good choice that time of year. Ron, is there anything you wanted to add about any of this?
No, it's just that it just shows that cut surface and low volume give you the opportunity to use the herbicide technique beyond the foliar. Is what just what I'm trying to say. You got out and I think you covered it. You have other options. Mm-hmm. Especially when the plants get too tall and you can't do foliar, you have to do cut surface or low volume basal on that plant, because you don't want to be spraying way up in the crown of the plant. So
right, and
so I think you covered it.
There are ways to do that. I've worked with for hire firms that have come out with mist blowers, and they can shoot 16 to 20 feet up, climbing bittersweet. But boy, it's a lot of product you're using at that point, and there's you can have a higher potential for pesticide spray drift in situations like that. So it's certainly, while you could get up there and get the leader of those plants, it's something I really try to avoid. So I would agree with Ron that it's better to go with a cut stem or basal bark in those kinds of situations where you have really tall stuff.
Correct. And you want me to cover this one real quick?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
One thing about herbicides, since they work on a growth process within a plant, the healthier that plant is growing, the better your herbicide's going to work and the less herbicide you have to use to control that plant. So if we have damage or we have a drought like we had last year, heavy browsing or pruning, they can all lead to poor efficacy, and you may have to actually use more herbicide to get control. And that's why I like to prescribe a foliar or basal bark for the most part, because we get the herbicide into the plant systemically, and they can take care of a entirely functioning healthy plant, and then the herbicide works a lot better within that plant. And that's what I'm just trying to get across in this. I mean, a healthy plant is better if you're going to be doing a herbicide application. The herbicide just works a lot better in the plant.
Right.
I'll let you do this one if you want.
Yeah, sure. I think there's kind of an idea that I ran into early on, that when everything else failed, then you would rely on herbicides, that they were kind of the last resort. And I have found that very much not to be true. There's a lot of text on this slide, but my takeaway is that there are a whole lot of elements that go into effectively fighting invasive plants and being very strategic and prioritizing, which I know is part of the invasive plant control practice plans that everyone's working on. That's a key element of it. You walk into, and I think we've probably all had this experience where you walk into a woodland that's invaded with just cheek to jowl honeysuckle, and it's like, okay, bring in the ATV with a 100-gallon tank on the back. It's a natural reaction, but it's not necessarily the best one in terms of where you start. When, herbicide used early on, small amounts of herbicide used early on can be extremely effective and can result in much better control than, okay, well, we're going to try this first and we're going to get some goats and maybe we'll try that. If you can go in with a small amount of herbicide with the beginning of an infestation and be very effective with it, boy, that's going to save you a lot of headaches on down the line. By the time, if you let it go, if a landowner lets it go and they're sort of scratching their head about what to do, and then you get to that cheek to jowl, 20 acres of honeysuckle, and then it is your last resort to show up with the ATV with the 100-gallon tank on the back. That's kind of what you want to try to avoid. So being strategic about how we approach invasive plant management and incorporating different elements of different control strategies is really the best way to do it. So I really don't like to think of herbicide as the silver bullet. I think of it as a tool in the tool belt. And the big picture is, if you have an intact, healthy native plant community, those areas are going to be much less prone to invasion in the first place. And so promoting, this is when Ron talked a little bit about cultural control, promoting native plants so that you have woodlands and natural areas that are less susceptible to be invaded, that are less disturbed in general. That's a good long-term strategy.
Yeah, and what I try to say is, I hear a lot of people talk about IPM. IPM means, I hear some people say my IPM means reducing pesticide use or not using it, using all the other tools, and then using herbicides only if you really need to. I think that's the wrong way to approach it, and I think you mentioned it right. Use a little bit of herbicide combining it with other control strategies is a better scenario than trying everything else and then waiting and use herbicide at the very end, because that could be dangerous, I think.
Right. It's really, for me, it comes down to a question of leverage. One of my favorite ways to control invasives is to do mechanical pretreatment. So with woody stuff, buckthorn, I have, unfortunately, my own wood lot is full of tall buckthorn. And I don't want to spray up in the air, and I don't want to spray natives. And so I'll cut that down, wait for it to re-sprout, and then come in with just a little bit of low volume foliar application, foliar applied glyphosate, and I get really good control that way. And so I'm leveraging, mechanical labor with a little bit of herbicide. And so that would be an example of an IPM approach to invasive plant management.
And that's a perfect approach, I think, because if you come in with the mist blowers and try and spray, you're going to take out all the natives that you have that you want to save. So I agree. I think we've killed this slide.
Yeah, it's dead. A lot of words.
So I put this slide in here, these are some herbicides that I've used and a lot of people use for invasive and hardy and even woody control. And you can see that most of these are either amino acid synthesis types of mode of action or growth regulator mode of action. And these are, they can be foliar, and soil means that they're residual. Foliage means that they're only work through the foliage of the plant to get in and work. So we're only going to talk about a few of these, but they're just a bunch of options, and a lot of the applicators that are on the call right now, or on the Zoom session right now, I know have used a lot of these, but today we're only going to talk about a few of them. But I just wanted you to know that each herbicide works differently, how it works on the plant, and just having a knowledge of that's very important in making a decision on which one to use.
I look at this list.
So I'll let you go and talk about this one.
Oh, I thought I was gonna hand it back to you for this one here, Ron. But I just wanted to, looking at that list, there's a lot of options, and I really only personally use 2 products and occasionally contract out a third. I think the most commonly used products are glyphosate and triclopyr-based herbicides, and I've recently used a little bit of imazapyr in Phragmites control, but it's a more comprehensive list than I think many of us who do this work will pull from.
Yeah, and the one that probably the imazapyr, and the one I'm not going to talk about, but another one that's really good is the Escort, the metsulfuron. I almost add it to all my brush control because it's very, very effective on multiflora rose, tree of heaven, and if you're just using triclopyr only, if you add it to your triclopyr foliar mix for honeysuckle, it adds 2 modes of action on the plant, which is a little better. But I won't go into that. But it is an option that I use a lot. Is the escort, adding it to my mixes. Growth regulators versus amino acid inhibitors. Growth regulators work very well early in the growing season when the plants are actively growing and cell division's occurring, which is right now. The Garlon or the triclopyr, which is what Garlon is, or 2,4-Ds are growth regulators. And in most cases, in almost all the cases, growth regulators are the selective herbicides. They're not going to control the monocots, the grasses and sedges, but they're going to control broadleaf plants. And like Amanda said, when we're working in an area that's like a field with a lot of grass, or a wetland, and you have some sedges and grasses in the wetland, these growth regulators in spring or this time of year, early summer, are great tools to use to take the broadleaf invasives out and leave the sedges and grasses to occupy the site in a control strategy, control management strategy, so they occupy the site and prevent the invasives from reestablishing. The amino acid inhibitors work well later in the year as the plants begin to start storing sugars in the roots. The glyphosate, imazapyr, they're more non-selective in their control on plants, but so they work in different types of the year. Glyphosate gets into the plant, it'll stay in the plant for a year or more. So if you spray it in the spring, it's just gonna wait till later in the year before it starts working on that plant. You may not see the effect, it's very slow, but you may not see that effect till later in the year. Amanda, do you want to talk about this one? Do you want me to talk about it?
Yeah, sure. I'll let you handle this one, Ron. You just have a little bit more fluency in different types of herbicide.
Okay.
Whereas I've never used a pre-emergent product, so I just as soon hand it over to you to talk about this.
All right. An herbicide needs to have soil residual characteristics for it to work as a pre-emergent. And when you think about pre-emergent, I think about if you think about some of the plants like garlic mustard or Japanese stiltgrass, mile a minute weed, they produce a lot of seed, and then the seed germinates the next spring. And if you have put a soil residual herbicide out as a pre-emergent, when those seeds start to germinate, they can control those germinating seeds. And they have to have a soil residual characteristic for that to work, and they have to have some long-term control. And that's a pre-emergent where you get it in before the plants actually emerge in the spring. And it prevents that germination and sprouting of the invasive plant. So an applicator needs to understand what types of other plants that herbicide can control before you want to use a residual or a pre-emergent product, because if you put it out and it's going to control also your native plants, that may not be something that you want to use. So you want to make sure you read the label, look at what that label or what that product controls well, because it may not be one that you want to choose as a pre-emergent. Residual can be good, but it can also be bad, like I said. If you want it to be selective in our approach and maintain native plants to occupy the site. So, and that's, like I said, that IPM cultural. Residual can be very good for controlling invasive plants, but the scenario of where that invasive plant's growing is very important, and what type of native plants are growing around that invasive plant before you would want to use something residual. So it's more, like I said, it's more dangerous to select a residual herbicide, especially when the invasives are growing in a community of native plants that you want to try and save. So
I can share a cautionary tale, and this will I'll use myself as a bad example here. I was unaware that imazapyr had residual soil activity for as long as it did, and this was several years ago. I worked with a company to do some Phragmites control. I had a grant to do this, and it was in a marsh area, in a small area, but surrounded by otherwise native plants, in addition to some cattail in a disturbed area. And this was several years ago now, and it's just now starting to recolonize. So I had kind of a big, prominently visible grayish brown patch in a marsh, and we did have very good Phragmites control, but nothing grew back for quite a while. I'm just starting to see some asters move in now and some seaside goldenrod. So I didn't realize that going into it, and I kind of learned the hard way. And it's pretty visible, and it's in a public area. So I ate a little bit of crow over that particular product. I was learning the hard way.
Yeah, usually one thing about herbicides is they're hard to hide your mistakes. So
Yep.
unfortunately. And they're usually there visible for a while. So you usually only make the mistake once. So it's good to make sure that if you're not sure about stuff to prescribe, don't prescribe it. Suggest in your plan to contact a licensed applicator to make prescriptions, especially for something like imazapyr. I'm going to talk about a lot of primarily the three products I'm going to talk about here are the glyphosate, the triclopyr, and the imazapyr. Those are probably the three main ones that I use, and they're probably the most effective for invasive plant control. I know Amanda talk about the sensitivity to Roundup. Roundup is glyphosate with the surfactant already in the mix, and the name came out with Monsanto a long time ago, but it's now made by Bayer. But the other product, Rodeo, is a straight glyphosate with aquatic labeling, and I've actually talked to people who said, well, we don't want to use Rodeo, and I said, well, we don't want to use the Roundups, and I said, well, I'm using Rodeo, and they say, well, good, well, that's good then. And they don't even understand that. They just think about the name Roundup, and they don't even have any idea what the active ingredient is in the products. They just hear the name Roundup, and it's enough to just turn people away. It's just interesting. So the Garland 4, Garland 3A, Vastland, those are the triclopyr products I'll talk about. Pathfinder II, it's a triclopyr and basil oil. The basil oil is actually a methylated seed oil, not a petroleum oil. But that's a product that's ready to use that you can use for basil stem and cut stump treatment. And then I'll talk about the Arsenal, which is the imazapyr. There's two different brands, Arsenal or Polaris, but they are the Arsenal products. So let's talk about glyphosate. Glyphosate either comes in concentrated form in the 40 or 50% active per gallon. Most of the stuff I use, like the Roundup Pro Concentrate or Rodeo, or the 54% active, or it's 5.4 pounds active per gallon. It's a non-selective herbicide, like Amanda said before. The Rodeo brand is aquatically labeled because it does not have a surfactant, where the Roundup brand has a surfactant and it's not aquatically approved. What's interesting is that the surfactants are more toxic to fish and salamanders and aquatic life, and that's the reason why the Rodeo, the glyphosate product alone can be applied to water, but it's the surfactant that's really dangerous to aquatic life. It's an amino acid inhibitor. It results in the depletion of 3 essential amino acids in the plant. So that's why it works best later in the season when the plant's producing those amino acids and starting to store sugars in the roots. It's foliar active only. It locks up so tightly with soil molecules that you can't even mix it with dirty water. If you mix it with dirty water, it'll lock up to the soil particles in the water and won't actually get into the plant. So there's no soil residual activity with this product at all. So you can apply it once it's dry. You can go through and do a planting on the site after you actually did the treatment. The Garland 4 Ultra, that's the triclopyr. It's selective. There's no grass control with this product. It's a auxin type plant response where it causes excessive cell wall rupturing as the plant grows. It's an ester formulation, so it can cause volatility or off-site movement in where the product moves into the vapor form and can move off-site. And that's there's two different types of product. It's formulations for herbicides. You either have the ester formulation or the amine or the salt formulation, which is the other type of triclopyrs I'll talk about here in a second. But it's absorbed through the leaves. But if you add the oil to it, you can get the oil to carry it through bark and stems and roots into the plant. And you can do that by combining the Garlon 4 with a bark oil, like an 80% bark oil, 20% Garlon, and you can use it for the basal bark and cut stump treatments. The foliar applications work better early in the season before plants begin to shut down. This is a good product for treating like vines, like the bittersweet vines growing in the woods this time of year when they're growing across the ground, or where you can get them with a foliar treatment. This product will work very well in the spring. The amine formulations of the triclopyr, the Garlon 3A and the Vasslan, they're aquatically labeled because they don't have a surfactant with them. There's no volatility with these forms, so if you want to minimize volatility, I would use the amine formulations of the products, and that would be the Garlon 3A and the Vasslan. But you will need to add that surfactant to the mix if you're going to do a foliar treatment. The Pathfinder II, like I said, is already pre-mixed, ready to use product for basal and basal bark applications, or either cut stump application. And you want to work on, like Jesse talked about this, smooth stems, and try and stay with stems less than 6 inches in diameter. It's a great year-round application unless snow or water prevents you treating all the way down to the ground, because you want to treat that bottom 12 inches of the plant and go all the way around the plant all the way down to the ground. And that triclopyr is transported through the bark with that bark oil into the cambium, where the triclopyr can work within the plant. The imazapyr, Amanda already talked about this. This is an amino acid inhibitor like glyphosate. It works on 2 different amino acids. These are different amino acids than the ones that glyphosate works on. So it's often used in combination with glyphosate. If you want to do Phragmites or knotweed control, if you can combine the imazapyr and glyphosate together, you're going to get a bigger bang for your application than just taking either one independently and using it. It's foliar and residual. Like Amanda said, it continues to work for a while, and especially in a wetland site where you don't have a lot of microbial action for the soil microbes to biodegrade the imazapyr. It's going to stay on that site a lot longer. It's a meristematic growth inhibitor. What will happen is it'll stop meristematic growth. So actually, if you spray early in the season on something like Phragmites, it won't grow any taller, and it'll stay green almost the rest of the summer. It just stops the growth. It's great for use on woody and herbaceous plants. It can cause injury and death in oaks and ash through root uptake and understory treatments. So my biggest fear is that somebody uses this as an understory treatment in an oak or ash stand. If that happens, you can actually end up killing a lot of the oak or ash in the stand, and that's something that you really don't want to do. It can even cause soil flashing, where it goes out through the roots in a cut stump. If you add it to a cut stump treatment, it can go through the roots and out into the soil and get picked up by another plant. That's called soil flashing. So you have to be careful where you use this. The site selection where you want to use the imazapyr is extremely important. And that's why you would want to leave it up to an applicator, an experienced applicator, to actually prescribe a product like this. But it is a very effective product if you can use it. And we'll go into some other scenarios later, hopefully in the discussion or later in the talk. Amanda, I'll let you take off from here.
Sure. And there are a couple of great questions that came up in the chat that I think we should just take a minute to address.
Okay.
Somebody asked about options for organically managed properties. And it's an interesting situation that I actually ran into. Maine Coast Heritage Trust has a property in Rockport, the Erickson Fields Preserve, which is a public nature preserve, but it's also the site of a big teen agricultural operation where we grow food for the Good Shepherd Food Bank. And it's organically managed, it's MOFGA certified. And we also, because it's an old farm, as you can imagine, all along the tree line and along old stone walls, we have a pretty significant invasive plant load. There's a good amount of bittersweet and then some of the shrubby invasives as well. And I have a couple of times tried to correspond with folks at MOFGA about herbicide use for controlling invasive plants, and if there are setbacks from crop, row crops, and I haven't gotten a clear answer. So that I wasn't sure exactly how that question was being asked. Is it for organic farm properties? I don't have a clear answer. I had a few different correspondences with folks at MOFGA, and it was really clear that from their perspective, they didn't want any herbicides used at all on any property that was used for organic farming. But then in other conversations, I've heard, well, as long as it's not the agriculture itself, as long as it's not herbicides used in agricultural productive, then it would be appropriate and it would not compromise MOFGA certification. So it seems like there's not clarity with that particular organic certifying organization. So that's if you're talking about an agricultural setting. If it's just overall, you have a landowner who just wants to do things capital O organically. There are a few products that are based on acetic acid. I talked about vinegar before, and jokes about salad dressing aside, they basically function as contact herbicides. And I will say that if you are going to use something as an herbicide, it has to be labeled as an herbicide to be in accord with the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. I think I got that right, FIFRA. You can't use a product that's not labeled as a pesticide to serve in the function of a pesticide. So that's a violation of that federal law. I don't know if there are state regulations to that effect as well. But technically it's illegal to pour, white vinegar from the grocery store onto weeds to kill them. I don't think anybody is going to haul you to court for that. But I will just mention that. So there are products, though, that are licensed and registered with the EPA as herbicides that are approved for organic use. And again, those are based on a high concentration acetic acid. They are organic, but they're not necessarily, perfectly safe. There have been some studies showing that there can be negative impacts on particularly bird life with using an acetic acid product. And the thing to keep in mind is you're just killing the part of the plant that it comes into contact with. You're not going to get systemic control using an acetic acid product. So then it begs the question, would you be better off, it essentially becomes a carbohydrate starvation game. Would you be better off just cutting, mowing, weed whacking, convert the area to a field basically and just mow until you exhaust the root reserves and exhaust the seed bank? So those are the kinds of questions that I would want to have with a landowner who was committed to doing things organically. So there's a couple of good, I'm just reading in the chat here. Oh yeah, somebody actually just asked, if you're using a contact herbicide, is there any benefit to doing that over cutting, mowing, flaming? In my opinion, and again, this is just my opinion, I would say no, because it's going to be much more expensive to be purchasing a capital O organic contact herbicide versus going out with cutting, mowing, flaming, etc. It's just going to be cheaper. It's probably going to be easier, and probably you're going to wind up with better results. So that would be my kind of gut check on that. Let's see. Oh, actually, Nancy, I don't know if you want to address, I'm seeing in the chat here that you've talked about treatments that were not close to agricultural production on certified organic properties. So that gets to the farming piece. Ron, do you want to chime in on any of these particular points here?
We can discuss some of those later when we get through the presentation too, if you want, but I think that's important to know if you've got organic farmers adjacent to our property. You have to respect that, especially for a herbicide application. So yeah, it's very important. If you have acetic acid, you have citric acid, most of them are acids, and I agree with you. You're just controlling the top of the plant, not the roots. So flaming it or cutting it would be the same strategy. So you're just depleting root reserves in the plant constantly, so with repeated applications. So.
Right. Somebody else asked a question I just want to touch on briefly about the half-life of different herbicides in terms of when they biodegrade. And I know there's a big range dependent on soil conditions, and Ron touched on this, talking about in a wetland situation where you don't have a lot of microbial activity, that imazapyr lasts for a long time. With the two products that I use the most of, triclopyr and glyphosate-based herbicides, the range can be anywhere from 2 to 3 days to 100 days, but it tends to converge on about 30 to 60 days is the range that I've seen in typical conditions. Ron, does that jive with your knowledge?
Yeah, that jives, because it's the soil microbes that are they actually, all these are biodegraded by soil microbes, so they have to actually ingest the compound and then break it down to carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, other compounds. So the better your soil microbe population is in your soil, the shorter the half-life. So.
Right.
And like I said, neither of those two products we talked about are soil residuals, so they're in the soil. They're not doing anything to other plants because we don't have the soil residual problem. It's just how long it takes for the soil microbes to digest them. So.
Right. So the nuts and bolts of how we actually do this, how we put herbicide in contact with plants. Low volume foliar is definitely a good option in my world. I tend to lean on my 4.5 gallon backpack sprayer, or my little 1.5 gallon, hand sprayer. Those are kind of my two, or even a 32 ounce Windex type bottle for really targeted control. Those are all low volume foliar application techniques. And basically you just want to bring the herbicide into contact with the foliage of the plant. So you're spraying the leaves. It's important to get good coverage. I have in my head about 80%. When you think about, imagine a clump of Japanese barberry and there's pretty dense foliage, you want to be making sure that you're covering about 80% of the foliage of that plant in order to get good control. It's interesting, and it's really easy to see. I actually was out looking at a barberry control area just last week, and I could see the places where you missed a spot and you still actually have a little bit of kind of stunted growth there. So it's not, your results may vary, your mileage may vary, but if you get most of that plant, you will have pretty good control, pretty good mortality. You have to get the terminal leader of the plant. And I've seen this countless times where I have a big clump of barberry and I've tried to cover it, but I just can't, I'm reaching up like this, and it's not a good idea to spray overhead. I don't recommend doing that. It's much better to get in and cut first. So that you can then treat the sprouts that come back up that are lower to the ground and easier to access. So low volume foliar is a good application method. I do like it very much, but it's not good in all situations. So if it's overhead height, it's not a great application technique, especially if you want to really work on minimizing drift. If going in with the chemical mist blower is an option, and you have a really invaded stand, and I'm thinking of some places that are floor to ceiling bittersweet, that could be a good option. But generally speaking, it's better for smaller, dinner table sized clumps that aren't 10 feet tall. And spray to wet, basically. The foliage should look damp by the time you're done. It should look wet, but you shouldn't have herbicide dripping off onto the ground. This is a cool tool. I actually just bought a couple of these last year. This is a buckthorn blaster, and it's a cheap tool, and it's great for getting really, really targeted control, and it works super well on buckthorn as long as the buckthorn hasn't been cut first. If you cut buckthorn down, if you do a mechanical pretreatment on buckthorn, you're going to get a zillion stems, and then it's going to have a growth form like Japanese barberry. And doing cut stem application on something with lots and lots of stems is send your interns that you don't like out to do that. It's pretty hateful work. So when you have a single stemmed woody species, this is a fantastic tool. It's, maybe it's $20. If you Google it, you can find these. I have an Iron Dog tool holster, and I always keep one of these in my belt, basically my belt tool holster when I'm doing invasive plant work, just because it's so effective and you get almost no non-target damage. So when you're thinking about kind of politically palatable herbicide application methods, this is a great one. But you are using a concentrated solution. So this is going to be a, full strength from your jug of concentrate, 25 to 50% solution.
And that's what this slide is. If you're going to do right after you cut, you want to use the Amine formulation. So that's a 50-50 or a 25-75 solution, like you said.
And if it's going to be, if you have to come back, let's say you're coming through with equipment, you're doing this on a big scale, you're going to be going through and doing like a forestry mowing kind of situation, and then you're going to be coming back the next day to do a chemical treatment on those cut stems. That's just what Ron said. You're going to have to use one of the oil-based products, so a Pathfinder Garlon 4A, because otherwise it won't uptake properly.
And that's what this is, the Pathfinder, the Garlon, and oil. If you can't do it immediately, you're going to have to come back and do the cut stump treatment with the oil-based, like the Pathfinder product. And the two different treatments, if you can do it right away, you just concentrate right on the surface. You don't have to talk about the root collar at all, the bark. But if you come back later, you have to treat it with the oil and the Pathfinder. You have to treat actually the root collar and the bark, because you want to get that oil to pass through the bark into the plant. So you're actually treating the root collar and not so much the surface of the plant.
What I've found to be successful with cut stem applications is one person cuts, the other person follows right behind them and sprays. And I've done it myself on a small scale with, I have a pair of clippers, pruning shears in one hand, and either my buckthorn blaster or a 32-ounce hand sprayer in the other hand, and you're coordinating. You could see this. Actually, Ron, could you go back to the slide with the buckthorn blaster? I wanted to point one thing out here. You can see that it looks blue. That is not the color of the herbicide. That's a tracer dye that gets added. And you can order that through, any kind of forestry suppliers type place. But it makes it, I strongly recommend using a tracer dye so you can see where you sprayed. Or where you blotted in this case. There's a red for oil-based stuff and a purple or a blue. They come in different colors, and they are, whether it's oil or water-based specific, but that makes it possible. And there's nothing worse than doing a whole bunch of cutting and then looking back and saying, oh, what did I treat? And then you wind up, missing stuff or using too much herbicide because you're not paying attention to where you were working. Thanks for going back to that. Let's see, somebody asked a good question. When using a cut first strategy for tall shrubs and following up with foliar spraying, how much regrowth should you have before spraying the regrowth? What height or leaf density do you wait for? The leaves should be full size. So, when something starts to leaf out, you want those leaves to be as big as they would be on a mature plant. Typically, this is a great time to do the pre-treatment, the cutting first, and then by August, I'll have enough of a biomass of above ground leaf that I can go back and do a spray. You can also do it the following year, so it's usually a few months. It's not an immediate thing.
And some plants are different, like glossy buckthorn. You can cut a glossy buckthorn and it can grow and produce fruit that same year.
Yeah.
If your infestation is really bad. So it depends on the plant also. So you want to get in there quick with glossy buckthorn or it gets over your head again quick. So.
Really fast, yeah.
I'll talk about this real quick. Is that basil bark. It's a great option for smooth bark plants. If we've got a bad infestation of autumn olive and it's tall, basil bark works fantastic on autumn olive because it's got a smooth bark. So, and the Pathfinder will work well on that also. It's another option for large bittersweet vines. So if you don't want to cut the bittersweet vine, it's another option for treating it with the basil bark, where you can treat the vine and kill the vine in the tree without cutting it and treating the surface, which is another example.
One thing I want to add about some of these application methods that I think is an important point for many. I work on the coast of Maine, so I'm frequently running into shoreland zoning issues. And from an erosion control standpoint, it's ideal to have intact roots in the soil. And when you're doing a cut stem or a basil bark treatment, or really any chemical treatment, you typically wind up with roots left in the soil, which is generally a good thing. So I'll just throw that out there as another consideration.
Yeah.
Let's see. Somebody asked the question, does it matter how close to the ground you cut the stem? I've had interesting, I own my own little chunk of woods here, and I have a beautiful plantation, an old growth plantation of common buckthorn, which I've been harassing in different ways to see how it responds. And it depends what you're gonna do next. If you cut first, I like to do cut first and then wait for it to resprout and then do a low volume foliar. I find that I get really good control of buckthorn doing it that way. And I use a clearing saw and it takes it down right to the ground. I don't like to bend over, and it's just straight up laziness. So it's kind of, what equipment do you have? If you're using loppers, it's just kind of more ergonomic to cut and leave, maybe a foot off the ground. So I think it kind of depends, what you're going to do. If you're going to do a cut stem, if you're going to use that buckthorn blaster approach, cutting to within about a foot of the ground seems to be working well for me. If you're going to do a follow-up foliar spray later in the growing season or the next year, you can cut it right down close to the ground, especially if you're going to be mowing, if you have equipment that you're going to bring in. I actually use my walk behind lawnmower in some places to just keep wearing out the shoots. I don't want to spray. I have a blueberry field, which I like to avoid. I don't want to kill any blueberries. So I tend to just repeat mow. So it really depends on the situation. Ron, can you speak at all to that question?
Yeah, if you're going to go through with a basal stem treatment of it in a week or so, of course you want a little bit of root collar, but you don't want a whole lot, because if you make it 2 feet tall, you got to treat that whole root collar. So if you're going to treat it with a cut surface treatment, like with the buckthorn blaster or a little Windex bottle right after you cut it, it can be right down close to the ground. But if you're going to come back and do the stump treatment with the oil and the Garlon, you want like maybe an inch or an inch or two of the bark on the stump, so you can spray that portion of the stem. And I agree, if you're going to come back in mechanically, you don't want tall stumps. So. Plus, you trip over it. If you're old like me, you end up tripping over them too. So.
It's not just you. I think I'll do that. That's a great question. Thanks for asking that.
And I put this picture in here because I wanted to show how this is some basal bark treatments of individual plants. And you can see it's an individual plant treatment. It doesn't pass through the soil and treat another effect. Like the picture on the right shows treating a maple in between an oak and a birch. So it's an individual plant treatment. And we can get into that. We'll get into that a little more as we go later and talk about treating within 25 feet of a wetland, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So I'm going to go into some unique control strategies with herbicides. With this, just some pictures. This is at Hebron, Nancy, a long time ago. This is the field at Hebron when we first started treating there. It's an old field at the Hebron site in Maine. You can see the autumn olive in the background, multiflora rose, but you can see it's an old field with a lot of grass. So what are we going to do with this site? So from using IPM and a control strategy, I decided to use the triclopyr because I want to keep the grass and control the broadleaf weeds. And this is what it was after a foliar application. And we talked about this in the large clumps. You can see the ones on the right. If you can't get the terminal part of the plant, you can see that over on the right on the clump, that plant's going to continue to grow. You got to make sure that you can get that foliage, that foliar treatment up on the top of the plant, or else you're not going to control that plant completely. So we talked about that a little bit. But you can see here how the selective herbicide works. It kept the site occupied with the grass and just controlled the broadleaf invasives, which is what we were doing. The next step here would be come in and mow it. And you would want to do this before seed source. For one thing, you want to get the plants controlled before they produce seeds. Then we'll come in and mow it and try and maintain this field as a grass site. Now, if I wanted to get selective with a non-selective, here's a site that has glossy buckthorn and bittersweet. You can see it growing on the ground, but I have a sugar maple seedling growing in the middle of it. So how am I going to treat all that invasive and not control my my sugar maple seedling? You can put a plastic bag over it, spray it with the glyphosate or the Roundup or the Rodeo with a surfactant. And once that product is dried on the leaves, you can pull the bag off and that you've selected, you've done a treatment and selected only for, done a broadcast treatment, controlled the invasive, but protected the native plant. If you forget to take the bag off, of course, you're going to end up controlling your native plant also.
Ron, I have to interject and just say that I use this method with the bag not infrequently, and I love it. And I've actually stolen that slide from you when I've done talks like this without you. So consider, what is it? Plagiarism is the highest form of flattery. It really, don't knock it till you try it. It works really well to throw a big trash bag over something you want to keep.
Yeah, and I know Christmas tree growers use a, sometimes when they treat, they'll put a big garbage can over the Christmas trees and then treat the weeds around the Christmas trees. Same type of effect. But with glyphosate, once it dries, they can't get into the plant, the native plant or the plant you want to protect. We talked about this. I know Amanda opened up and talked about timing. Invasive plants leaf out earlier, and they also hold on to their leaves longer, which makes them a easier target for foliar application. I've used this trait a lot. This is an example on the left. You have the blue flagging is on an oak sapling, and then you can see the honeysuckle starting to bud out behind it. This is a treatment where we went out early with the triclopyr before the foliage developed on the oak tree, and then you can get a broadcast foliar treatment and protect natives by going out early. This is another example. This is a little early, I think, when I did this trial, because the buds had just developed. I think I would wait till the buds developed a little longer before I would make this type of treatment. But just showing the effect, you can see the controlled honeysuckle here, and you can see the native plants around it that are just starting to leaf out that didn't have any effect from the foliar application. So that's a way to target invasive plants that are leafing out early. There's a few of those, euonymus, barberry, honeysuckle. It's a great time to scout for them on your property early in the year, but it's also a good time to come in and treat them before the natives start leafing out. And the other example is some of them hold on to their leaves a lot longer. Glossy buckthorn's one that will hold on to the leaves longer than the natives. I went in and treated this second week in October, and this is 7 months after. You can see there's still a lot of glossy buckthorn there, but a lot of the natives had already dropped their leaves that time of year, and you can go in and treat your invasive plants later in the year. And honeysuckle's another one. I've treated glyphosate on honeysuckle late in the year, even when the leaves start turning yellow. If you can get in and do a foliar treatment with just glyphosate on honeysuckle late in the year, it just sucks the glyphosate up and works very well late in the year when a lot of our natives have already lost their leaves. And this is my favorite, the common buckthorn. This plant doesn't even have the guts to even turn color. The leaves, they just continue to stay green all year. But this is November 14th. This common buckthorn growing in the understory here. I treated it with glyphosate, and he came back the next spring, and you can see it was effective in controlling that common buckthorn, and all the other natives around that had already lost all their leaves are actually protected. So very effective on common buckthorn. They probably hold on to their leaves longer than anything else that we deal with. We'll talk a little bit about honeysuckle control. Talking to my colleagues in other parts of the U.S., if you go out and just treat honeysuckle foliar with just triclopyr alone, it's not as effective as if you can choose glyphosate and treat later in the summer to control honeysuckle. And like I said before, glyphosate on honeysuckle, even when the leaves begin to start turning yellow, is very effective. If I'm going to use triclopyr early in the season on honeysuckle, I'm probably going to add another product to the mix, like Escort, or Mazapyr, or another product like Milestone. But even just adding one more active ingredient in the mix is a better product for early treatments with just triclopyr alone. Barberry is usually easy to control with either glyphosate or Garlon. It's probably one of the easiest invasive plants. It responds very well to herbicide. And it's another one of those early bud break species where you can use Garlon on it early in the spring, or you can use glyphosate on it late in the fall. Knotweed. This is when people ask me how do I control knotweed? My first question is, where is it growing? Because that is that's the question I need to figure out for what type of prescription to use for knotweed control. Because if you can only have to use glyphosate only for knotweed, it's going to take multiple applications, especially for very large stands of knotweed. But if you can get in there and use a combination of something like glyphosate and Mazapyr and Escort together, it can work very well. But you have to worry about root zone pickup with the products like the Mazapyr that we talked about earlier. Sometimes with knotweed, I like to use a growth regulator earlier in the year, like the Milestone or triclopyr. So if I can't get in there and keep knocking it down, I'll use a growth regulator like the triclopyr. It'll work on it early in the year. It'll make it kind of sick, but it'll start responding again by the end of the year. And that's when I come in with the second application with a different mode of action and use the glyphosate. The other option would be with knotweed is to continue to mow it down, and reduce those root reserves over the summer, and then let it grow back later in the summer, and then treat it with the glyphosate after the root reserves have been weakened for that plant.
Ron, I've had outstanding control with that particular application method, or that control methodology with knotweed, is cutting it a few times, really harassing it, and then doing a late season, late August, early September treatment. I want to add one quick note about knotweed control if I can, because the question always comes up about tarping. And it takes a really, really, really long time, but Coastal Mountains Land Trust has a knotweed control project in the Duck Trap River watershed right in the riparian zone, where they haven't wanted to use any herbicide, and it's been going on for, I want to say, close to 12 years at this point. And we have a conservation easement on the duck trap. So as the easement holder, and we have some affirmative rights in our conservation easement, I was able to go in after 12 years of tarping and do a very, very small amount of stem injection to just drive the coffin nails shut. And so, yes, tarping can work, but it's a much bigger deal than just lawn stapling some black plastic down. It can take a lot of time, but if you have a situation where it's desirable to use as little herbicide as possible, it's a really good way of dramatically reducing the molecules of herbicide that you use. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yes, another definite example of IPM with combined.
Right.
The other thing about black tarping the land, the soil is that the soil gets baked and you lose a lot of your soil microbes in the soil. So when you take that tarp off and use herbicides, the amount of soil microbes in the soil are pretty minimal. So that half-life for that herbicide may be a little longer on that site after a treatment like that. All right, we'll talk a little bit about application in and around wetlands. Do you want to do this one, Amanda? Or do you want
Yeah, sure. Maybe we can tag team this. Every time I have to do an application near a wetland, I have to refresh myself as to what the Board of Pesticides Control regulations are. And I just actually have started going through this again because I do have a bittersweet situation right on the edge of a wetland. So in order to do an herbicide application within 25 feet of a wetland, you'll need a variance from the Board of Pesticides Control. There are some exemptions to this. You can do a spot treatment, it's not basically anything that's not a broadcast treatment. So a cut stem treatment or a basal bark treatment is not a broadcast treatment. It is considered a spot treatment. So you can go right up to the edge of a wetland there. So there are some ways to do applications within that area that don't require a variance. I will say, just it's not a big deal to get a variance. You need to have a plan, basically, which all of, this is exactly what we're doing is learning how to write these plans. So that shouldn't be an issue. But the biggest issue is whether or not your applicator has to be licensed, have an aquatic applicator's license in order to do this. And the pesticide has to be licensed for use in and around water and wetlands. So that's one of the reasons I always buy Rodeo. And I don't even know if they make Accord anymore. But the glyphosate product that I use is, they don't, okay. So it's the glyphosate product that I use is licensed, is regulated for use in and around wetlands because it doesn't contain that carrier that Ron talked about that's toxic to aquatic life. Let's see, I'm just trying to think of other, yeah, you need to be licensed, you need to be certified in aquatics. When in doubt, call the Board of Pesticides Control. The staff there are fantastic and they can answer your questions very well. I
would suggest that if you have questions, contact the Board of Pesticide Control proactively. They're very good to work with, and they'll help you on how to apply for a variance. I mean, it's a lot easier to work with an organization like DEP, Maine DEP, or the Pesticide Board proactively rather than reactively after you've made your treatment wrong. So
yeah, the DEP,
and they're very good to work with.
What I found most frequently, what I need if I'm doing an application in or around a wetland is a NERPA permit by rule under Section 12 for activities adjacent to protected natural resources. So that's the permitting situation with DEP that I have most frequently encountered. Ron, have you encountered any other DEP permitting considerations other than the NERPA?
No, probably is or they call it the NERPA or the NIPD's permitting. They have a general permit, the state does, for forestry, so that's the one that we would use.
Okay. One thing that I've found is that typically, even if it's allowable, even if it's permittable, I have encountered a lot of folks that just have an inherent gut reaction to not want to use herbicides in and around wetlands. On almost sort of a cellular level. It's just sort of a for people who may be on the fence about chemical control in the first place. So it tends to be a particularly good place to look at IPM, integrated pest management strategies. I'm thinking again about the situation of the knotweed growing along the duck trap river. It would have been, we could have, or Coastal Mountains could have gone through the permitting process and brought in a licensed applicator to do that, but there was just this organizational kind of, we just don't want to. So that's another consideration when thinking about working with landowners, that even if it's allowable, you might run into resistance. I know I've seen this many, many times.
Yeah, and I think when we write our plans and you've got invasives within 25 feet of a wetland, it just need to make sure that we consult the Board of Pesticide Control or Maine DEP or get an applicator that's licensed to do those types of applications before we do anything in those areas. So I think it's important to put that in your plan.
Yeah, because it can add to cost. I mean, you're talking a couple of $100 in permitting fees at a certain point.
Right. So I can talk about this real quick if you want. Do you need a commercial or a private applicator license to make an application? If you're treating on your own property, that you don't, it's not open to the public, you do not need an application. But if you're working on property that you don't own or lease, or it's compensation under contract, you need to be a licensed applicator. If the property's open to the public, you're going to need a licensed applicator to do the work. Or if it's a government employee and you're doing applications, you're going to need to have a commercial license. The other type of license is a private license. That's when making applications on property that you own or lease, and that's to produce that agricultural commodity like food crops. And what's interesting here is that we'll get into it later. To purchase herbicides, sometimes if they're restricted in the state of Maine, you're going to need to have a commercial license before you can actually even purchase some of these products. And I'll go into that a little later. But pretty much if you're on your own property, you don't have the public coming onto your property, you don't have hiking trails or whatever, that landowner can make applications with general use herbicides on their own type of property. But if it's open to the public or it's a government entity property, that application is going to have to be made by a commercial applicator.
There's one exception to that, Ron. Do you want to talk about the exception with properties that are open to the public?
No, you can go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, so I learned this one before I got licensed. Since I work for a land trust, I took kind of a deep dive into this to figure out if I, in fact, did need to get licensed. And there is a provision that allows for a property that is open to the public for there to be non-licensed herbicide applications. So anybody who works for or volunteers for a land trust is kind of the classic example to make an herbicide application, as long as the area where that treatment takes place is closed to the public for 7 days during and following the application. And it was really designed, I used to call it the land trust loophole. And Gary Fish, when he was at Board of Pesticides Control, would always cringe because he didn't like the idea that it was a loophole. It's not a loophole. It's a provision to be made for certain circumstances. So I will just throw that out there because I know we have some land trust folks here in the room.
But and the other option is if you don't close it, you just need to, if you treat it, you just need to post it if you're a commercial applicator. So
right,
that's the other option. And there's different types of licensing. This is from Megan Patterson, who's from the Board of Pesticide Control. I stole these slides from her. But the different exams, there's different categories, and I want to talk about this because invasives don't always grow in forests. They don't always grow on roadsides. They don't always grow in water. They grow everywhere. So when you treat an invasive, your category may not be for municipal treatments. So you may have to go get that municipal category on your license to treat on a municipal site if you're just a forestry category certified. So there's different categories you can get certified in. And that fee for the licensing is about $105 for a 3-year license. And you need 9 credit hours, and I think we get 3 from just this course only. So and if you're doing the work, your company needs to have a spray contracting firm license, which is a different type of license also, on top of just having the commercial pesticide license. So herbicide applications by unlicensed individuals, like a landowner that has a piece of property that's not open to the general public, they can apply general use pesticides on their own property. And unless the property open, and that's unless that property is open to the public or the general or the government. General use means it's a not restricted use, and that's labeled by a federal restricted use product, or the state's labeled that as a restricted use. And state of Maine restricts anything with an aquatic label on it. Any herbicide with an aquatic label on it, Maine puts an additional restriction on it, so it's not a general use product. So glyphosate, non-aquatic products like the Roundup Pro, the Garland 4 Ultra, the Pathfinder, they're all general use products that a landowner can purchase and use on their own property for invasive species control. So that may be something that if a landowner wanted to do their own treatments, they can use products like this on their own property. Like I said, as long as it's not open to the general public or it's not a government property. So if I go into some of those, rodeo has that aquatic use on the labeling, and it's been on there for several years. And the glyphosates with the surfactant in them, like the Roundup Pro, are not aquatically labeled, so they would be a general use product, but a rodeo would be restricted. The Arsenal, the Amazopirs, they have aquatic use on them on their labels, so they are restricted in the state of Maine also. And the amine formulations of triclopyr are aquatic use also, like the Garlon 3A and the Vaseline, they both have aquatic uses. So they're all restricted under Maine's pesticide regulations, so a landowner could not purchase those to use on their own property. They would have to purchase a general use herbicide if they wanted to use it. You would have to have a commercial pesticide license to actually purchase these products in the state of Maine. So I've got about 8 minutes to go through this. Nancy, are we on till 9:30 here?
That's right, Ron.
All right. I'm sorry we kind of dragged on. We're not going to have a whole lot of time for questions, or do you want to open it for questions now?
So Ron, I can give you some of my time. So why don't you, finish your presentation until 9:30, and then we can have some time for Q&A.
Well, I'm glad you told me to take 20 slides off of that. So, all right, we'll talk about weather a little bit. Again, this was another 1-hour presentation, and I'm going to drop down to like a couple slides. But when we think about weather, we talk about 4 different things. We talk about precipitation or rain. We talk about wind, and wind has both speed and direction. The temperature and humidity are 2 other factors that we think about when we think about weather. When we think about rain, that herbicide needs to be put on the surface like a leaf, and it needs to be watered into the soil to work to be taken up by the roots. So applications before severely heavy rains can be wasted applications. That pesticide will wash off the leaf or can even wash off to another area, and then it means you may have to retreat. So you want to make sure that that pesticide stays on that leaf long enough, or it stays on the soil and just gets sort of watered into the site, doesn't get washed off the site. So 2 important factors. Don't want to treat before heavy rains, definitely for sure. If you've got heavy dew, if you put a pesticide drop on a leaf with a very heavy dew, that surfactant's going to cause that that droplet to spread out in the water, and it's probably going to get that leaf to remove most of the water, most of the dew that's on the leaf. So you're not going to get the exact active ingredient from that pesticide into that leaf. Most of it's going to drip off the leaf onto the soil. And if you're using a foliar only treatment, you're not going to get that product into the plant. So it's always good to wait till that heavy dew has come off of the leaves before you do a foliar treatment. Rain fastness is something we talk about, common term we use for pesticide applications. Applicators need to select pesticides with rain fastness traits necessary for what weather projections we have at the time of application. If you look at the 2 different products we talked about, triclopyr, which is the Garlon, and glyphosate, like the rodeo, the triclopyr can pass through a leaf cuticle usually within 30 minutes. It gets into a plant very, very quickly. So you can treat in the morning and then have an afternoon shower. Most of that triclopyr's already moved through the leaf into the plant. Glyphosate can take 2 to maybe even 6 hours to fully penetrate that leaf, get into the plant. So if you're treating with glyphosate and you get a rain shower within a couple hours, if that droplet washes off that leaf, you may not get that full impact of that glyphosate on the plant. You can add adjuvants or stickers to it to help stick that active ingredient to the surface. And once that droplet's dried, it can prevent the wash off in the application. So selection of a pesticide with good rain fastness characteristics, that's an important factor, especially if you've got rain predicted. If we talk about wind, it has both speed and direction, which can affect your application. So if you're applying a pesticide in the form of a spray droplet, that wind speed and direction are extremely important factors that you need to be aware of before we start pulling the trigger, because that wind can carry your spray droplet away from your intended target, deposit it off-site. So you may be controlling some of the native plants adjacent that you want to keep, or you may be spraying onto that, carrying those droplets off onto that organic farmer site, and then you're going to be in real trouble. So that event's called drift, something that we as pesticide applicators want to prevent. You want to make sure that that droplet is going to its intended target and not moving off site somewhere else where you don't want it to go. And that occurs when that pesticide moves to a non-target area during your application. It can cause damage to desirable vegetation. It can lead to unwanted environmental, financial, and public relation consequences because that droplet's carrying your pesticide license and your wallet with it. Think about that. When you release that droplet, your wallet and your pesticide license attached to that droplet. So think about where that droplet's going. Talk about temperature and humidity. That can affect the evaporation of your spray droplets. If evaporation happens before that droplet actually reaches your target, you lose efficacy. You're not going to get that product into the plant. And that's most effectively on a vapor particle, and that's known as volatility. And volatility occurs, and the only product that I can think of right now is the Garland 4 Ultra product, which is an ester. And that product's got volatility issues with it. So if you're treating above 85-degree day and your humidity is very low and you're spraying small droplets, that Garland 4 Ultra product can volatilize, turn into a vapor particle, and can move very far distance from your application and can cause some serious injury downwind from where you're doing your application. So on those hot days, low humidity days, I would switch to the amine formulations of triclopyr like the Garland 3A or the Vaseline products. Temperature inversions, we've all seen these in the morning. That's that layer of warm air may develop over a cooler air layer. It can happen at any altitude. It can be thick or thin. And they can hold small spray particles aloft for several minutes to hours. But you don't know when that inversion layer decides to lift. You have no idea which direction it's going to move. And these are usually occur when there's actually zero wind going on. You may think, oh, this is a great time to go out and do an application. I don't have any wind. But if you're putting out small droplets, let's say you're using a mist blower and putting out small droplets and you do it in an inversion, you can have some serious impact downwind from drift. And the reason, if you look at the regulations, pesticide regulations in the state of Maine, they specifically say that wind speeds have to be between I think it's between 2 and 15 miles an hour. And the reason they put it at 2 is they don't want you doing a pesticide application in an inversion. So they don't want you spraying in zero wind because it may be an inversion. So try and stay away from those spraying in an inversion, especially if you're using those small droplets, because it's unpredictable where those spray droplets may end up when that inversion decides to lift. So in summary, monitor those uncontrollable factors like rain, wind, temperature, get in a weather prediction before you do your application, use your proper equipment and chemistry for the type of weather you're going to get for that day. Selecting the appropriate pesticide formulation, and that's esters or amine formulations. Large droplets are better than small droplets. Minimize that nozzle pressure. Sometimes when we use those hand pump backpacks, when you're walking around looking for a plant to spray, you just keep pumping and all of a sudden you hit that nozzle and it comes out as a huge mist. That's because that pressure is too high. You want to minimize that pressure. Shorten that distance from the nozzle to the target. So you don't want to be shooting way up high with your backpack. Shorten that distance from the tip of your nozzle to the target, and that can minimize drift. Add buffers or drift control agents if necessary on windy days. Determine any sensitive areas prior to application treatment. That's always a good idea. And if if weather conditions don't favor the equipment that you're using, then that's time to don't make the application and maybe move to a more favorable location or wait for a different day to do your treatment. So I'm sorry, that's all we have. It's a lot of information. So
thanks again so much, Ron and Amanda, for sharing with us your presentation this morning. It's fantastic to learn from your experiences. And I was looking through the comments and in the chat, and I think that we have addressed almost all of the questions there. There was one question that, and I did have to step out briefly, so it may have been covered, but I wanted to make sure. Sherry had asked about when first using a cut first strategy for tall shrubs and following up with foliar spraying, how much regrowth should you have before spraying the regrowth? What height or leaf density do you wait for? And Amanda, you had talked about this strategy, so I wondered if you might address that question.
Yeah, I mean, basically, if you have a sprayable target, and it depends on your timing, but I keep thinking about that expression, the best time to prune is when the shears are in your hand. I'm really hoping to do a big mechanical pretreatment for a honeysuckle honeysuckle forest. Like 10 minutes ago would have been ideal to do a foliar follow-up later this growing season. The fact is the contractor is busy, and it may not be until July that I can get him to go out and do some forestry mowing for me, which means that my follow-up might be the beginning of next growing season. And so, because I don't know that I'll have a target, you want enough foliage, you want fully formed leaves, ideally. Ron showed a great picture of himself doing chemical control of shrub honeysuckle, and he had mentioned, maybe it would have been better for the leaves to be just a little bit more fully formed. So if you have a fully formed, grown-up looking leaf, then that's an appropriate target. And it just depends when you can do your mechanical pretreatment and what the growing conditions are like. I mean, we're all experiencing, increasing summer drought, and, great, I don't have to mow my lawn as much, but it means it's going to retard plant growth. So there's a lot of variables there. But the bottom line is if you have what looks like a mature leaf, you have a target for foliar follow-up.
Yeah, I would
Great.
agree. And I mean, it depends on the species, like knotweed. Knotweed, glossy buckthorn, like I mentioned before, they can grow very fast compared to other plants.
Yeah.
And they can get up over your head quicker than, so you're going to have to monitor it, and it all depends on the plant. But I think, like Amanda said, once you have that start getting those first fully developed leaves, you can get the product into the plant. That's the best. And if you can minimize that target, I mean, that distance between your spray net tip and the plant, then you're going to get better control and better efficacy than if you have to reach for it. And you minimize pesticide use also.
Thanks. So if anyone has questions so we have a new question in the chat from David about, are there any recommendations for both Garlon and glyphosate in a tank mix?
I'll talk about that if you want me to.
Go for it. I'm just laughing because of the first time I tank mixed those products, I added the different chemicals in the wrong order, and I wound up with like a congealed, there was this precipitate that formed, and it was like, what the heck even is this? So yeah, there are, go ahead, Ron.
I can't remember which label it says. I think it's the rodeo label that says you need to mix the rodeo first, and with half of the water before you add the Garlon to the mix. But I'm going to talk, and that's compatibility. I mean, you talk about that on any label. Before you mix products, you should jar test them before you put them in your tank, because if you do what Amanda said she did, then you've got a huge mess to try and clean up inside your spray tank. So you don't want to do that. But let's talk about What'd you say? Sorry.
I'm just laughing. Gary Fish, when he was with Board of Pesticides Control, always used to say RTFL, read the fact-filled label. So I don't say that to pick on the person who asked the question, but to highlight my own failure to RTFL before tank mixing.
So triclopyr works very, very, very fast on a plant, and it causes cell wall rupturing of the plant cells, and it actually ruptures or destroys the vascular tissue of the plant. And glyphosate works very, very slow on the plant. So it needs that vascular system of that plant to be working. So the two products actually work against each other. So in some of the applications, what we do very, very low amounts of triclopyr and higher rates of glyphosate in a mix, because you don't want to blow up the vascular system of the plant. You want the plant to stay alive long enough for the glyphosate to work also. So they really don't work very well together. But if you do, you want to make sure that your triclopyr levels are very low. It's like destroying your chimney in your house and then lighting a fire in your fireplace. You don't want to do something like that. So, does that make sense, I hope?
It made sense to me, Ron. That was helpful. I also just want to say, if anybody has a question that they prefer to ask out loud, you just need to use the raise your hand feature. So that's located under the more actions. It's like a little face with a hand in my Teams menu bar, and under that one, there's a little hand, and so you can raise your hand, and I'll call on you and invite you to unmute yourself. So yeah, any other questions for our veteran and our not a rookie here before we let
She's a
them
vet.
go?
She's
I
a
think she's a
veteran.
veteran too. Kim has a question in the chat about knotweed growing up through high bush blueberries. Ugh.
Oh, bummer.
Yeah, she asks, is Pathfinder II on cut stem the correct choice?
You could do that, but Pathfinder II is really expensive. Pathfinder II is a great product, but I use it very sparingly because it's like 4 times the cost of a rodeo type product. I would probably, I was kind of making fun of this thing at the field session last week. I have a JK injector tool, which I should run out to my shed and grab it, but it's over there. It almost looks like a pastry gun, and it has a little tank, watertight tank that you can put concentrated herbicide in, and you pull a trigger and think about a big hollow embroidery type needle. And I know that all of you are needle pointers, so you know just what I'm talking about, that has a hole in it. And when you pull the trigger, it delivers a 5 milliliter calibrated dose of herbicide, and it's designed specifically for Japanese knotweed. And Ron, I know you use these too. That's probably what I would use. And I would use glyphosate because it's cheap. And I would probably do a stem injection if possible, because then the nice thing about that is when you cut, then you have the rest of the thing, and it's just logistically annoying. So probably that's what I would do. If you were going to actually cut with some shears or loppers or something like that and spray down into the cut stem, I would still use a glyphosate product simply for the expense, and it's effective. It works.
Great.
Do you guys
thanks.
see this on the screen right now?
It's coming up, Ron. Yep, there you go. We see it.
Yeah, that's the JK injector. So this is a good, if it's growing in blueberries and you don't have a lot of knotweed, this gets the product into the plant. It's not a volatile product, so it will control the roots of the knotweed, and it won't affect your blueberries. But you have to get every stem. This is just a picture of with one tank full. And then this is what one tank full will do. So if you can see this, I don't know if you can see my arrow or not. You've got this one stem growing right out of the middle of it that I missed. So you have to get every single stem with these. But this is a way, either that or you can cut it and squirt glyphosate down into the hollow stem. That's another option. But that way it will only control the individual plant. It won't control the blueberries. But it also depends on how much knotweed you have. You really don't want to get into carpal tunnel issues either.
You can also really quickly go off-label with this application method because you're using concentrate. And so in terms of molecule of active ingredient, the JK injector tool or anything like that is going to, over a larger area, you're going to very quickly exceed the rate per acreage that's specified on the fact-filled label. So it's really only applicable in very small stands. Or that's what I used along the duck trap after almost everything else was dead. It was really easy to see the residual targets.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. Jake asked, would you have to inject each and every stem in the patch? And Ron answered that question. The answer is yes.
Yep.
Eric also mentioned a very targeted foliar herbicide using a sponge type applicator, something similar to the buckthorn blaster, except a larger sponge. would be a way to treat foliar, but not with a spray. That would be a possibility. And Rob just reminds us, or he's asking about drought conditions. In drought conditions, the stomates, the gas exchange pores on the leaves, close, and the ability to bring chemical into leaves is retarded. Any comments and tips for summer applications with extreme conditions so the chemical gets into the plant? We had issues last summer, especially with waxy leaves.
Cut stem, I would say. I would also wonder, and I don't know that this is true, but I have a sort of a gut response to that, that applying, if you need to do a low volume foliar application that early in the morning, you would have better uptake. That's just kind of based on how plants do their thing. Any thoughts on that from Ron or Nancy or anybody else out there? That could be a strategy.
Yeah, I think the cooler it is, and there's a little more moisture in the morning, so the stomata would probably be open. But I think that's where your surfactants come into play, because in a drought, a leaf will form a thicker cuticle on the leaf also in droughts. So the better your surfactant is, the better chance of it getting into the plant. So maybe a methylated seed oil to help get it into the plant, which is a more aggressive surfactant, just adding a little more surfactant to the mix to get it in. And you may have to up your rate a little bit in a drought. Like I said, the plant's not actively growing as well as it would in a great summer. So the herbicide's not going to work once it gets into the plant as well as if that plant was actively growing. So maybe a little more active ingredient, the upper end of your prescription level, that rather than in the bottom end of the prescription on the label.
It looks like we have a question from Carl regarding the effectiveness of a wick applicator application on knotweed. I wonder if that's referring to Eric's comment about foliar herbicide, sponging the foliar herbicide. Eric, if you've done this yourself, you could unmute and comment on the effectiveness of that technique, or Amanda or Ron, if either of you have done that.
I have not done it. My comment would be, it doesn't really matter how you get the herbicide on the leaf. It's a matter of getting it on there in good coverage in a controlled manner. I don't know if.
And I would do it.
Defer to Ron.
I would probably do it before the stalks got too tall. You could probably do it when the stalks are maybe 3 feet tall. And a lot of people do this. They do it with Phragmites too, also out in bogs, where they'll take the rubber glove and then they'll put a cloth glove over it, or a cotton glove over it with glyphosate and water, and they'll just take the stem and wipe the entire stem. They do it in Phragmites. I imagine it would work also with knotweed too, but that one thing about knotweed is the stem is green. So if you get the glyphosate on the stem too, it works. That's one thing about spraying knotweed, not just the leaves, but the green stem. It's important to get the green stem also.
So we might have time for one more question. So if anyone has burning questions about herbicide modes of action or methods of use, now is the time. You can either raise your hand or type it into the chat. And while we're pausing a minute to see if anyone has any more questions, just again, so much thanks for Ron and Amanda for taking the time this morning, and not just this morning, but to pull together 3 hours worth of presentation into an hour and a half. I really do appreciate their time today. So any last questions? Seeing none, thanks so much, Amanda and Ron. Fantastic presentation. And
Thanks.
if people have questions, Ron and Amanda, is that something you're open to fielding any questions?
Yeah, absolutely. I welcome that. I'm pretty easy to find. I'm just adivine@mcht.org, and you can, if you go to Maine Coast's website, you can get to me pretty quickly.
Yeah, you can get to me at ronald.lemen at you can do it at the Gmail. It's easy to remember that, ronald.lemen@gmail.com.
Great.
And I enjoy solving problems too, so I enjoy doing it. when people
Right.
call me, I mean, every situation's different. So somebody asked me if there's a cookbook method, and there really isn't. Every situation is completely different, and you have to look at each situation differently, because you know what type of herbicides work on a specific plant, but if that plant's among 4 or 5 others there, you have to change your prescriptions and your strategies. So
Ron, maybe you and I should work on our next project of writing that cookbook.
yeah, we can do that.
And all
I'm
our
getting ready to retire, so I'll do the writing. You
Great.
can do the trials.
All right. Okay. Thanks so much, Ron and Amanda. Really appreciate your time. And we're going to transition now into the next item on our agenda.